Hello class. Today we will be looking at communist countries, particularly Russia and China. We're going to compare what they did and called communism to what Marx described when he was talking about communism. So today, most Americans in particular think that communism is bad, but when they're thinking of communism, they're thinking of what Russia and China did. And so what we want to do is compare that to what Marx did. Because some of you, after discussing Marx, might have thought, well, this doesn't sound so terrible. Why does everybody hate communism? Well, we're going to look at what the countries of Russia and China actually did when they tried to create a communist state. So the first country to turn communist was Russia. Russia will be renamed the Soviet Union, the USSR, which in Russian script in Cyrillic is CCCP. The symbols for this new country will be the hammer and sickle. The hammer is the symbol of the industrial worker, and the sickle is what you use to slash down crops, so it's the symbol of a farmer. So these are working class symbols. Russia is heavily agrarian at this time. They are not industrialized practically at all. So what would Marx think about Russia becoming communist? Marx would be surprised that Russia's communist because he was describing this happening in industrialized cities where there's more proletariat, right? So how does this happen in an agrarian country? Well, that brings us to the first Soviet leader, Vladimir Lenin. Lenin leads a revolution during World War I. So there's two revolutions we talked about in Russia in 1917. The second one sees the communists topple the baby democracy because that new government, which had overthrown the Tsar, the Caesar of Russia, hadn't pulled out of World War I. So when the communists come to power, they quit World War I, as you'll recall. But then a civil war starts in Russia. And this is because Vladimir Lenin led this revolution with what he called a vanguard, a very small group of revolutionaries. Because he thought that they could not be open about their desire to be a revolution and to create communism because the Tsar ran a police state, and so he would have arrested them all. They didn't have freedom of speech in Russia before communism. But then they're not going to have freedom of speech after communism either, because Lenin is going to say, well, all these peasants who aren't the proletariat and they're not actually on our side and they're not saying they want communism, it's because they've been tricked by all these bourgeoisie lies. And so we are going to topple the government, create communism, and we're going to have to stop free speech for a while until we can re-educate the peasants so that they can see through the bourgeois lies. And then once we've convinced them that we're right, then we can give them free speech and all those things, but not until then. And it's probably going to take a while for us to re-educate the peasants. Right? So Lenin creates a system that keeps a police state, just like the Tsars had, to spy on his own citizens and to squash free speech and protest. During this civil war, it's the communists versus kind of everyone else. The United States actually sends troops in to try and help topple this new communist government, which is one reason why Russia or the Soviet Union will be very paranoid about the United States going forward. They kind of have reason to be very suspicious. And obviously the United States doesn't want the Soviets to be communist because communism is the enemy of capitalism and the United States is capitalist. Right? Okay, so anyway, you could think about if somebody else had intervened in our Civil War, how we would have responded. So, all right, so then Lenin dies a few years later from several strokes, and a guy named Joseph Stalin comes to power. Lenin had actually very specifically said Stalin should not be the guy to take over because he thought Stalin was paranoid and kind of a psychotic person, and he was right. Stalin uses the secret police to round up and execute anybody he thinks of as enemies of the state. And that means anybody who can be seen to even slightly criticize the Soviet government or isn't sufficiently loyal to Stalin himself. Stalin demands total loyalty to himself. And if you're an unpopular figure, he might have you executed because then you're giving the Communist Party a bad name. If you're really popular, he might have you executed because then you might be able to challenge him for power. So it's really a dangerous time to be in Russia / the Soviet Union. This period is what we call the Great Purge. We also see neighbors turning on neighbors out of a sense of trying to save themselves, like, oh no, I'm not disloyal, you want these people over there. People will be rounded up, put in front of what are called show trials, which is just a trial like for a show. It's you've already been convicted, like you know the outcome before you put on trial. It's not a fair trial. And then they're sent to prison camps called gulags, where they are worked to death. So basically, Stalin squashes free speech, there's no free elections, and over 20 million people are killed under Stalin's watch, intentionally, right? Intentionally. He creates what are called 5-year plans in an attempt to industrialize Russia, and he sets production goals really high. So he'll say, okay, you're a steel factory, you used to make 1,000 tons of steel a year, now you're going to make 10,000 tons of steel by each year in 5 years. And these goals are really high, and they're like never really reached, but it does succeed in producing more stuff. So even if you don't make it to 10,000 pounds of steel or tons of steel per year, you might hit like 6,000 pounds or tons per year, and that's still a significant improvement over the initial 1,000 pounds. So they are effective. And then every 5 years he redoes them, basically. He also collectivizes farms. So what this means is he takes the peasants' land, he takes it away from the landlords, but instead of giving it to the peasants, he creates big farms that lots of peasants will work on, and the farms are owned by the state, and so therefore who owns the food? The state owns the food. And so he will, the government will take the food that's produced and redistribute it around the country to the people who need the food. Same with the industrial 5-year plans. It's not the workers saying, hey, we're going to produce this much. They're not in charge here. It's the government that's in charge. Okay. There's something called the Holodomor, which was a year-long famine in Ukraine, which at this point is part of the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union includes more than just Russia, hence the Union part. And Ukraine is part of this. And basically, this is an intentional famine. Stalin gets really angry at the Ukrainians, who are a bunch of these peasant farmers, because they don't want to give up their land to the state. And so he still takes the land, and basically he sends in Russians to take all the food that the peasants have been growing and refuse to let the peasants eat any of their own food. And he actually, there's so much, it's not that there's a shortage of food, there's plenty of food to feed all of the people of the Soviet Union. In fact, Stalin's even selling grain to other countries at this time, but he's intentionally starving the Ukrainians. So 3 to 7 million Ukrainian peasants die in a year. So that's an even higher death rate per year than the Holocaust, for example, under Hitler. Hitler will kill more people, but not not per year. So Hitler kills 11 million over the course of a couple of years. So this is not a natural disaster. This is intentional. We would consider this a genocide because Russia under Stalin is intentionally trying to wipe out the Ukrainians and then send in Russians to then settle and farm this land. So the Russians today do not admit that this was intentional, but the Ukrainians definitely claim it was. And even if you could make the argument that Stalin didn't mean to kill all these people, he definitely knew what was going on, and he could have redirected resources and stopped it. And quite frankly, nothing really happened in the Soviet Union without Stalin knowing what was happening. So the outcome here, even today, this is why you're seeing a war between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine is terrified of becoming under Russian control again, because the last time they were under Russian control, after the Soviet Union falls apart, they break away and they become their own country. And Russia wants to control Ukraine. It's got good soil. It has gas pipelines and natural resources and access to the Black Sea and therefore the Mediterranean Sea. So Russia a couple of years ago went in and just took this peninsula. They just took it. And now they're fighting like a covert war with Ukraine, pretending that it's a civil war, sending Russian troops in there with Ukrainian uniforms and trying to take Ukraine over. And the Ukrainians are freaking out because the last time they were under Soviet rule or Russian rule, there was a 7 million person death toll in a year. Okay. Stalin creates what's called a cult of personality. And he will not be the only leader to do this, but it's a really good example here. The cult of personality is, well, a cult, the difference between a cult and a religion often boils down to what happens when you try and leave. A religion, if you leave your religion, your life doesn't end. If you try and leave a cult, you could you might not be able to make it out alive. And a cult leader has this worshipful following. So a cult of personality is when you have a political leader, not a religious, well, you could have a religious leader too, but here we're talking about political leaders using mass media, propaganda, or other methods to create an idealized, heroic, and worshipful image through unquestioning flattery and praise. So if you see a ruler trying to cultivate an air of like larger than life, I'm amazing, everybody, I'm like the father of the country. Here you have him holding up a little child. You'd see these pictures in schools, in people's houses, marching in the streets, saying how much they love him, and any questioning of his policies would get you, killed or sent to a gulag. That is a cult of personality, right? Can you think of other countries today that, or in other parts of history, that have a leader with a cult of personality? You could list current day Russia's Putin, who controls the media and often depicts himself as this amazing heroic guy who discovers ancient lost treasures in the Black Sea, which is ridiculous, or, wrestling a bear or whatever. North Korea's Kim Jong-un. The Un family is basically considered the Kim family is basically considered gods in North Korea. Hitler, Mussolini are all really good examples. Warning signs. What would warning signs of a leader trying to create a cult of personality be? Trying to control the media, trying to fire anybody who disagrees with them, demanding loyalty to himself instead of the state or the country or the Constitution. Anything along those lines. Okay. The totalitarian versus authoritarian states. These are terms that people often mix up. They are different, although neither one is necessarily a kind of country you'd want to live in. Totalitarian has the root word total. So this is where a government wants total control over their population. They want their love, loyalty, obedience, and devotion. Would the Soviet Union be a totalitarian regime? Yes, absolutely. Stalin wants total love and devotion. They want their people marching in the streets with how much they love the state and the government and the leader. Authoritarian states just want obedience from their population. They don't really care what you think. They just want you to sit down and shut up. Right? So neither one of these countries give you free speech or freedom of protest, but they have different agendas. So in an authoritarian regime, you can probably make it through if you just keep your head down. In a totalitarian regime, they want, your brain and your heart along with your obedience. Okay, let's look at China really quickly. China will become communist like 30 years after Russia. So Russia 1917, China in 1950. It's even more agrarian than Russia was. The leader will be a guy named Mao Zedong. Mao, again, is his family name. Zedong is actually what we consider his first name, so you call him Mao. He's the leader. He's a war hero because he helped defeat the Japanese invasion during World War II, and he gets a lot of love from the peasants because he redistributes land to the peasants. He thinks the peasants are awesome. He takes power after winning a civil war, which finished up after defeating the Japanese in World War II. So he comes to power. He creates massive farms owned by the state, even bigger than the ones in Russia. He initially tries to create a 5-year plan like Stalin did, and it does work, and it increases industrialization, but he decides that he doesn't want this separation between countryside and city life. He wants everybody to be a peasant, the great amazing Chinese peasant. So instead of building more factories in cities, he tries to create what's called the Great Leap Forward, where he will have peasants not only grow food on these big communes, but also make their own steel. Well, you probably don't have to guess it might not be too difficult to figure out that that's not going to work. The peasants try really hard, but they're making steel in conditions that steel can't really be made in. The furnaces don't really get hot enough. Even if they do, they're made out of, subpar material. People are melting down, like, not just iron ore, but like pots that are a mix of like iron and tin. So it's not good quality, and it's very brittle and it breaks. But because the peasants are busy doing this, they're not making enough food, and so there's going to be a famine that kills 20 million people. This is unintentional, killing 20 million people, but it still kills 20 million people. And part of that is because the government wasn't getting good information about the fact that there wasn't enough food being produced, because nobody wanted to give bad news to this new government, because Mao has created a cult of personality, and so nobody wants to give bad news to him. And you can see here just this poster. This is very cult of personality like, right? Similar thing kind of happened with coronavirus recently, and the current Chinese president, Xi Jinping, nobody wanted to pass up the line that, like, hey, this thing was happening and it needed to be dealt with. They initially fired the first doctors who reported it, right? Okay, so anyway, in total, Mao kills about 40 million people. Well, again, the 20 million from the famine are unintentional, and then there's another 20 million due to an additional, like, popular revolution that he stokes called the Cultural Revolution, and he also murders a bunch of landlords when he's taking the farmland and creating these massive farms, which, did Marx say you had to murder the landlords? No, just taking away their means of production would make them the proletariat, but the peasants wanted revenge for all the bad treatment, and so that's what Mao gave it to them. Okay. So you can see we have cults of personality with Mao. We have cults of personality with Stalin, right? You see today Kim Jong-un is even worse. The cult of personality in North Korea has had several famines under his leadership. Well, and his father and his grandfather. Partly because they overtax the soil, and we just don't really have time to get into it. So overall, what would Marx think of what China and Russia did in North Korea? Would he consider this communism? Yeah, not really. No, not at all. But there are some things that the communist governments did that Marx would like. The Soviet, Chinese, and Cuban communism did do some things that Marx would have liked. So if you think about what the kinds of things Marx wanted, they did these things. So equality between the sexes. The Soviets, the Chinese will do this. So the Soviet government will put a woman into space 20 years before the Americans do, because, again, men and women are equal. Literacy rates and education between boys and girls in the Soviet Union and China will be better than what's going on in the United States. Women will still be told in the United States that don't worry about learning math, just get a husband. Whereas in China and Russia, they are learning math and the sciences. These countries will provide healthcare for all. Even through today, the Cuban healthcare system, it may not have as much advanced technology because the United States cut off all trade ties and tried to force everybody else to cut off trade ties with Cuba. But it does take care of all its people. And actually, on average, they have better healthcare outcomes because all the Cuban people have access to healthcare and preventative care and regular doctor's checkups, because even if you wouldn't be able to afford it, the government does it for you. Yeah, and they provide education for all, so everybody gets an education. The Soviet literacy rate will actually be higher than the United States' literacy rate at this time. And they pledge to take care of all citizens. Of course, if you're accused of being disloyal, you're going to get sent to a prison camp. But as long as you're not accused of being disloyal, they do pledge to take care of everybody and feed everybody. Again, of course, not unless you're a Ukrainian peasant under the Soviets. So there's definitely problems in these countries. It's definitely not what Marx would have considered communism at all. They do some things that he would have liked, but a lot of things that he would not have liked. Namely, not having the peasants or the proletariat own the means of production, clamping down on free speech, committing, genocides, creating cults of personality, all of those things, and creating societies in agrarian places instead of industrialized places. None of those are what Marx had in mind. So when people think of communism and think of it being bad today, they're often thinking of what the Soviets and the Chinese did, and the North Koreans, but that's not what Marx had in mind. And so hopefully by the end of this lesson, you now understand why there are communist parties that exist today and get votes in Greece, in France, in other places. Even if they're not in power, they still exist and people want to vote for them because they're looking at what Marx said and not what the Soviets and the Chinese actually did.